They stood so still on that stage you'd think they'd been carved from old wood. 3 children, barefoot and blanketed in burlap sacks, heads bowed so low you couldn't even see a glimpse of hair. Not a shiver, not a whisper. The heat that afternoon sat heavy on my shoulders, making the world shimmer at the edges. Yet somehow, those 3 figures looked colder than the shade. I didn't plan to be there. I had ridden into town for salt, nails, and a length of rope to fix the paddock gate. But I heard the auctioneer's call echo down Lantry's yard, and before I knew it, my horse was tied by the trough, and I was standing among townsfolk whose names I barely bothered to remember. I had lived alone on the ridge for 6 years by then. After the fire, I took my husband and Childa, so I'd come to believe I built my walls high, both the ones of timber and the ones in my chest. The cabin wasn't much, but it stood against every storm. That day I'd thought my heart was as weathered as those walls. I thought it couldn't splinter again. But then I saw the scar. It was nothing more than a thin, pale ribbon of old hurt winding around a small wrist, peeking out where the sack didn't quite hide the child's hand. It caught the sun just for a second, like a whispered memory. My chest clenched so tight it hurt to breathe, because once, long ago, I had wrapped linen around a bleeding wrist that bore the same mark. I had hushed sobs with trembling hands, saying, "Easy now, it'll heal." The auctioneer barked, voice scraping across the dusty yard. 3 for the price of 2. Don't ask for names, they don't have 'em. Don't ask for stories, nobody knows. They're quiet, healthy, and already cried out. No one cheered. Most folks just stared, some with pity, some with quiet horror they'd never say aloud. And me? My legs moved before my mind caught up. I don't remember deciding. I remember stepping forward, coin purse in hand, hearing my own voice like it belonged to someone else. "I'll take them." The auctioneer squinted, sweat trailing down the cracks of his face. "All 3? You want to check 'em first?" "No." "You sure?" "I'm sure." I emptied my purse. Copper and silver clinked together, smaller than the sum of my doubt, yet somehow heavier than my fear. No one stopped me. The crowd parted like brittle grass in wind. They brought the children down. The oldest stepped first, guiding the other 2 as though every breath weighed twice as much. I reached out my hand to the smallest one. They flinched like I'd raised a whip. I stepped back. "Come, if you're willing," I murmured. They followed. Not toward comfort, not yet, but toward something they hadn't had in a long time, a choice. On the ride home, the wagon creaked under us. Dust curled from the wheels, trailing behind like a faded memory. The sacks came off, but they kept their gazes on their laps. The smallest chewed a piece of jerky so slowly I thought they'd swallow the salt before the meat. The oldest sat rigid, hands knotted tight, and the middle one, the one with the scar, they just breathed, shallow and careful, like even air was something they didn't quite trust. The road back to my cabin winds through a stand of weathered pines. By the time we passed them, the sun had dipped low, laying a copper wash over the ridge. My chest felt as tight as it had years ago, standing before 3 small graves I'd never truly seen, only imagined, after the fire. When we arrived, they stood outside the cabin door, waiting, watching, like stepping inside might cost more than they had left to give. "This is home," I said. My voice came out softer than I meant. "Yours, if you want it." They didn't answer, didn't move. I pushed the door wide, letting lamplight spill across the dusty floorboards. One by one they stepped inside. The youngest, knees knocking, sank to the rug near the hearth. The middle one stood near the table, head turned as though listening for something. The oldest lingered at the threshold until I nodded. Then they crossed into the room, closing the door behind them. That night, I laid quilts by the stove, soft and patched from years of mending. They lay down without words, without glances at each other. Silence wrapped them tighter than any blanket could. I watched from my chair until the lamplight burned low, the flame flickering like a tired heart. And when the middle child shifted, pulling their sleeve back in sleep, that scar caught the light again. Old fear rose sharp in my throat, but so did something else. Hope. I barely slept. I kept asking myself the same question over and over. Could it be? By morning, the children still hadn't spoken. I didn't press. I cooked porridge, left bowls on the table, and stepped outside to fetch water. When I came back, the bowls were empty. Not felt like a beginning. I worked the fields that day, mending the fence the wind had bullied half apart. The children hovered near the porch, watching but not coming closer. When the sun began to tip westward, I washed and set the table for 4, though my hands trembled as I did. They entered the cabin one by one, sat in silence, spoons hovering. I offered bread, a bit of honey from the last jar. The youngest eyes went wide at the sweetness. The oldest nodded, almost imperceptible, in thanks. Still no words, only breathing, only presence. That evening, as the lantern glowed gold against the log walls, I watched them watch me. I saw the questions in their eyes, too heavy for voices they hadn't used in too long. And for the first time in years, I spoke into the silence, almost a prayer. I lost someone once, too. None of them flinched, none of them asked. But the middle child, the one with the scar, looked at me for the first time, really looked. And in that look, something opened, like a door unlatched by trembling hands. I didn't know where it would lead, but I knew I had to step through. It's strange how quickly you can get used to silence when it becomes your shared language. The children spoke none, and I spoke little, yet in that hush, something unspoken took root. The next morning I woke before the sun cracked the horizon. The cabin felt different, with 3 quiet souls breathing in it. I lay there for a moment, staring at the low ceiling, feeling the weight and wonder of their presence pressing against my chest. Then I rose, stoked the fire, and set water to boil. They stirred when the smell of oats and wood smoke mixed in the air. The youngest blinked awake first, eyes still cloudy with sleep, and then the oldest sat up slow, watchful as ever. The middle one, the scarred one, lay still a moment longer, as though caught between worlds, then finally turned their gaze toward the hearth. We ate without words. Spoons scraped gently against bowls. The steam fogged the window glass, and outside frost clung stubbornly to the earth, waiting for the sun's mercy. After breakfast, I stepped outside to split wood, the axe biting through half-rotted logs. When I turned, I found them standing on the porch, each in the same posture, arms tucked close, feet bare against the cold planks, watching me with that quiet, unblinking attention. I didn't speak, only nodded toward the stacked logs. The oldest stepped forward first, picking up an armful to carry to the wood box. The other 2 followed, small shadows moving carefully in my wake. It wasn't obedience. It felt more like willingness. When the task was done, I caught them glancing at each other, like they'd shared some silent agreement. And then the middle child, the one whose scar had haunted my dreams all night, looked at Mena down, not away but right into my eyes. I felt my breath catch, and for the first time, the smallest shift of something that might have been trust crossed that child's face. Days turned like the pages of an old book, slow, stained at the edges, and softer than I dared hope. They followed me around the ridge as I worked, fixing fence posts, checking the henhouse, shaking out quilts to air in the brittle sunlight. They didn't ask why, they simply watched. And slowly, each found small ways to help. The oldest gathered kindling without being asked, the youngest learned to scatter corn for the hens, and the middle child watched the goats with an eye so careful they noticed a limp I'd missed. I showed them how to brush the stubborn old mare that pulled my wagon, how to rub warmth into cold-numbed hands, and how to check the sky for weather. These were things no one had taught me outright, only learned through years and loss. And now somehow it felt like passing on a legacy I never thought I'd share. At night, we ate by lamplight. I spoke little of my past, but sometimes, when the wind moaned against the walls, I tell stories of the ridge. The year lightning struck the old oak, or the spring, the creek swelled so high it carried fence rails off into the valley. They listened, really listened in that deep, wordless way only children who've had to listen for danger know how. And though they didn't answer, small signs of belonging began to bloom. The youngest left a wildflower on the table one morning, shyly placed beside my cup. The oldest swept the hearth without prompting, and the middle one dusk while I mended a torn shirt by the window, reached out to hand me a needle I'd dropped, their hand lingering on mine just a moment too long to be mere politeness. That touch nearly broke me open. One evening the wind picked up fierce, rattling the shutters and turning the lantern light into trembling shadows on the walls. We'd finished supper, and I was gathering plates when I heard it, a hum soft as a breath, from where the middle child sat cross-legged on the floor. It was only a fragment of melody, barely there, but it froze me in place. Because I knew that tune. I'd hummed it once myself, back when small bodies curled against my sides on cold nights, when the world felt too wide and too cruel, and all I had to offer was warmth and song. I turned slowly, careful not to scare it away. The middle child didn't look up. The hum faltered, then stopped. Silence fell heavy, thicker than before, but I'd heard enough, and as I washed the dishes, my heart ached with a hope too dangerous to name. We didn't go into town for weeks. I told myself it was because winter was biting hard, that the wagon wouldn't hold well on muddy roads. But truth was, I wanted to keep them hidden from eyes that pry and tongues that cut. Yet the ridge couldn't shield us forever. At last, supplies ran too low to ignore. Salt, flour, lamp oil, they wouldn't stretch another week. So, one gray morning, I harnessed the mare and told the children we had to go. They said nothing, but I saw fear flicker in the youngest's eyes. The oldest squared their shoulders, and the middle one drew the smallest closer, hand resting lightly on their back. The road to town felt longer than I remembered. At every bend, I half expected to meet suspicion, accusation, or worse. When we rolled into Lantry's yard, folk turned to look. Conversation paused. Not loud judgment, just that cold, lingering stare that weighs more than any word. I stepped down first. The children followed, close behind, eyes on the wagon boards, shoulders drawn tight. Inside the general store, Harriet Morrison paused mid-scoop of sugar. Her gaze moved from my face to the three shadows behind me. "Morning, Ada," she said, voice as flat as winter ground. "Morning," I replied, forcing calm. She weighed my flour, poured lamp oil into a small tin, and didn't ask questions. But the silence between us rang louder than any accusation. As I handed over my coins, I caught the middle child watching Harriet, gaze sharp and wary, like a stray dog ready to bolt. My heart clenched. On the street outside, Samuel Tibbets, the schoolteacher's husband, raised an eyebrow. "That them children folks been whispering about? They're staying with me," I said, trying to keep my voice level. He studied my face. Worlds hard on children, with no names. I met his gaze. "Then let them have mine." He nodded once, turned away. Didn't say more. The walk back to the wagon felt a mile long, every step echoing with the weight of eyes behind curtains and whispers behind doors. But when we climbed up and the mare started forward, the youngest leaned gently against my arm just for a moment. The oldest sat taller, chin lifted, and the middle child watched the road ahead as if daring it to test them. In that moment, I realized it wasn't only me protecting them, somehow we were already protecting each other. That night, by lamplight, I gathered my courage and asked the first question I'd dared since they arrived. "Do you remember a different name?" The room stilled. The oldest looked at me, eyes dark and careful. The youngest glanced at the middle child, waiting. The middle child's hand twitched, as if wanting to speak but not finding the breath. Finally, they raised their sleeve, slowly, revealing the scar again. Their fingers traced the pale line, then rested over their heart. No words came, but none were needed. In that silence, my memory spoke for both of us. The night I'd wrapped that wrist, the promise I'd whispered, "Easy now, you're safe." Could it really be them? Could the fire have taken so much and yet left this one small miracle? I didn't dare say the name on my tongue. Not yet. Not until they gave it back to me first. And so the days went on, winter creeping in earnest, frost thickening on the eaves, wind scratching cold fingers around every corner of the cabin. Yet inside, something warm had begun to grow. I didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but for the first time in years, I felt something like hope settling beside the old grief. And that night, as I lay listening to 3 steady breaths in the dark, I realized we were still silent, but we were silent together. Winter on the ridge doesn't ask permission. It just comes quiet, merciless, settling in your bones before you even see the first snow. I'd survived many winters here, but never with 3 silent shadows beside me. The first frost turned the ground brittle, and the wind found every crack in the walls. Each dawn, I'd wake to see the youngest curled tight under the quilt, breath puffing small ghosts into the cold air. At first, I tried to shield them from it. I patched the gaps, hung blankets over doors, banked the fire deep at night, but winter has a way of stripping away all that's thin, and slowly, I saw the children weren't as fragile as they looked. One morning, ice had sealed the chicken coop door shut. I tugged at it, hands burning from the cold. Before I could curse the stubborn latch, the oldest stepped forward. No words, just quiet resolve. They gripped the bottom plank, braced their boot against the post, and heaved until the ice cracked free. For a second, they looked at me, chest rising hard with breath, eyes waiting for something to nod. A word, anything. I offered a small smile, tight at the edges but real. Their shoulders eased. Inside, the youngest learned the rhythm of the hearth. When to feed it, when to leave it. She'd stand close, palms out, as though the flames were speaking a language only she could hear. The middle one's scar on the wrist. Eyes that saw too much watched me cook, memorizing every movement, the pinch of salt, the way I tested heat by hovering my hand over the pot. Sometimes I'd glance over and find those eyes fixed on me, steady and unblinking. It rattled me more than I cared to admit, because every time a thought returned, stubborn and dangerous. Could it really be them? The days shortened. Night fell before supper ended, and the cold pressed close around the cabin walls. But inside, something softened. I caught them making space for each other near the fire. The oldest would pull the quilt so the youngest could share. Once, half awake, I saw the middle child tuck the smallest one's hair behind her ear, careful as a prayer. These were things no rule could teach, only belonging could. The town, though, was another matter. One icy morning, I rode into Lantry's yard alone. Supplies again. The children stayed behind, tending goats and sweeping the porch. Harriet Morrison barely looked up as I stepped inside, but as she weighed the sugar, she spoke low, almost like talking to herself. "They say you brought in strays." My hands stilled. "They're not strays." She kept her eyes on the scale. "Folks say all kinds of things. Then let them." She wrapped the sugar in brown paper, folding it precise. "It's a hard world for children without a name," she murmured, sliding the bundle toward me. "I know," I said. And maybe it was my voice, or maybe something in her memory, but for the first time in years, Harriet met my gaze. Her eyes didn't soften, but they didn't look away. Outside, frost glistened on the wagon rails. As I tied down the bundles, Samuel Tibbets crossed the street, boots crunching on the ice. "You keeping them close?" he asked. "Yes." He nodded once, slow. "Town's talking more, just so you know." I met his gaze. "They talked when I buried my family too. Didn't stop me from burying them." His jaw worked, like he was biting down on something unsaid. Then he turned, walked back across the street without another word. I rode home heavy with what wasn't said. The road felt longer than usual, frost biting at my knuckles where the gloves had worn thin. But when the cabin came into view, smoke curling steady from the chimney, 3 small figures waiting by the fence, and me breath eased. The youngest ran first, skirts catching snow, boots barely tied. The oldest waited back, one hand resting protectively on the middle child's shoulder. I climbed down, handed them a small sack of hard candy. Their faces didn't light up, but the youngest held the bag like something sacred. The oldest nodded once, and the middle child's fingers brushed mine as they took it, eyes meeting mine in a silent thank you. That night, as snow thickened outside, I dared to ask what I'd held back too long. Do you remember anything before? The oldest looked away. The youngest fidgeted, clutching the quilt, but the middle child's scar catching the lamplight held my gaze. Slowly, they lifted their wrist, fingers brushing the white line. Then, with a hesitation that hurt to watch, they reached for my hand. Their touch was light as breath, but it was enough. Memories flooded, sharp and burning. The night of the fire, the way small hands had clung to me, the smell of smoke and fear and blood. I whispered, voice shaking, "Annie!" They didn't speak, just pressed my hand tighter. It wasn't an answer, but it wasn't denial either. Winter deepened. Snow piled against the door. Wind howled through the rigid night. But the cabin stayed warm, held together by old timbers, stubborn nails and something new. I taught them what little I knew. How to mend a ripped sleeve. How to set snares. How to read the sky for signs of thaw. They listened in that quiet, grave way of children who've learned too young how to survive. And slowly, a rhythm formed. Shared chores, silent meals, and nights by the fire where words felt less necessary than presence. One morning, the middle child surprised me. As I braided my hair by the hearth, they stepped closer, hesitant. Without speaking, they reached out, clumsy but gentle, and took the braid from my hands, finishing it with trembling fingers. The knot was loose, uneven, but I wore it all day. Because it wasn't about the braid, it was about trust, about a child remembering or wanting to remember that once I'd braided their hair, humming a tune neither of us dared to hum aloud. But the world beyond our fence didn't forget. One Sunday, Sheriff Boone came riding up the path, coat dusted with snow, face drawn tight. I stepped onto the porch, heart sinking. He dismounted, slow. "Ada," he began, voice low. "Words come from Bent Creek." My breath caught. "And a preacher there claims 3 children went missing from an orphan house. Thinks these might be them." I swallowed. "What happens now?" He sighed. "They'll likely send someone to see, someone who says they remember." Behind me, I felt 3 small shapes in the doorway, listening without showing it. I forced steel into my voice. "I won't let them be taken." He looked tired, older than before. "I know," he said softly, "but it might not be your choice." Then he tipped his hat, turned, and rode back down the hill, leaving his words hanging in the cold air like breath that wouldn't fade. That night, the wind rattled the shutters, and fear crept in with it. I sat long by the fire, the children curled on quilts close enough to feel the heat. I didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but I knew this. I would stand in front of them, even if it cost me everything. Because in that silence, in those small, brave acts of trust, they'd become mine, and somehow, impossibly, I'd become theirs. And no paper, no preacher, no judge could unmake that. Some days the world outside felt farther away than the next ridge. Other days it felt close enough to breathe down our necks. After the sheriff's visit, the children moved quieter through the cabin. Even the youngest, whose small feet used to tap the floorboards in restless circles, tiptoed now. The middle child kept watch by the window at dusk, eyes scanning the path as if expecting a dark shape to appear through the trees. And the oldest, always so guarded, took to sleeping near the door, blanket wrapped tight, eyes half open, as if daring the world to come knocking. I didn't ask them why. I didn't need to. Fear makes its own language, and we all spoke it without words. Nights grew longer. Snow deepened in the yard, blanketing the goat shed, bending the apple branches until they groaned under the weight. By lamplight, I taught them letters scratched into scraps of wood. The youngest traced them with a fingertip, tongue caught between her teeth in concentration. The middle one caught on quickest, eyes flicking from my hand to the letters like a sparrow darting from branch to branch. The oldest pretended not to watch, but I'd see them mouthing the shapes later by the hearth, lips moving silently. Sometimes As the fire burned low, the middle child would catch my eye and tilt her head just slight like she was trying to decide if memory was worth the pain of speaking. But the words never came. Then came the night I heard it, a soft humming in the dark. I'd woken to add a log to the fire and stood frozen by the hearth, listening. The tune was broken, halting but familiar enough to stop my breath. Hickory Hill. My voice, my song, the lullaby I used to hum over small, feverish heads. I turned, heart pounding, and saw the middle child, eyes half closed, humming so quiet it barely stirred the air. They weren't looking at me. The song wasn't for me. It was for them, a thread of memory strong enough to hold on to. When the tune died, they opened their eyes. For a heartbeat, I thought they'd speak, but they only pulled the quilt tighter and lay back down. Still, it was something. Proof that memory hadn't burned away completely. A week later, the snow broke just enough for church. I hadn't planned on going, but something in me decided it was time to show our faces again. We rode in the wagon, bundled in old coats. The youngest sat close enough that I felt her small shoulder against my arm, while the middle child stared at the road ahead, lips tight. The oldest sat at the back, watching the horizon like a scout waiting for trouble. When we reached town, heads turned. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. Even the blacksmith paused, hammer lifted over glowing iron. I held my chin high, climbed down, and helped the youngest from the wagon. The oldest jumped down without waiting, eyes sweeping the street. The middle child moved slower, every step measured, as though they were weighing what it meant to cross from the safety of the ridge into the hush of staring eyes. Inside the church, the air felt heavy with unsaid words. We took a bench near the back. The preacher's voice droned over verses I barely heard. My ears were full of the smallest sounds. The youngest's shallow breaths, the oldest's restless shifting, the soft click of the middle child's nails against the wood. When the hymn began, I dared to look around. Some folks pretended not to see us. Others didn't bother hiding their stares. Mrs. Kendall's lips pressed so thin they nearly vanished. Harriet Morrison met my gaze just long enough to nod once quick, but enough to say, "I see you. I see them." After service, people drifted into the yard. No one spoke to us at first. The children stood close, silent. Then Samuel Tibbets walked over, hat in hand. "Cold morning," he said. "It is," I answered. His gaze flicked to the children. "They managing the winter?" "They are," I said, firmer than I meant. He nodded, slow. "That middle one's got your eyes, Ada." The words took me off guard. "Maybe," I whispered. "Doesn't matter much whose blood runs in who," he said, looking past me, to where the youngest had picked up a pebble and was turning it over in her palm. "What matters is who stands beside him when the snow comes." I swallowed. Voice caught in my throat. "I stand beside them." "I know," he said, and walked off. But good words don't quiet a town for long. That evening, Sheriff Boone returned. His coat carried road dust and cold. "They've sent someone," he said. "A woman from Bent Creek. Calls herself Sister Merritt." The name landed heavy as iron. "When?" I asked. "Soon," he said. "Maybe days." Behind him, the youngest stood in the doorway, watching. The middle child stepped up beside her, silent. The sheriff lowered his voice. "Ada, be ready. She says she remembers them." I felt heat climb my neck. She can't have what isn't hers. His eyes were tired. "They might not see it that way." "I don't care," I said, voice steel. "I know," he sighed. "And that's what worries me." After he left, I gathered the children by the hearth. Snow whispered at the windows, wind testing every board. I spoke low, steady. "Someone's coming. Someone who might say you belong elsewhere." The youngest frowned, confusion and fear twisting her brow. The oldest clenched his fists until knuckles whitened. But the middle child didn't react, just looked at me, silent as ever. I took a breath. "What they say doesn't matter to me. You belong here, if you choose it." Still no words, but the middle child stepped closer, until their shoulder brushed my arm. That was answer enough. The next morning I checked the fence, the barn door, every latch and hinge. I moved bedding farther from windows, showed the oldest where I kept the shotgun, though I prayed we'd never need it. Fear twisted inside me, but beneath it lay something fiercer, resolve. They'd come through fire before, so had I. We'd do it again if we must. That night, as frost painted the windows, the middle child finally spoke. Voice dry from disuse, barely louder than breath. Will she take us? I looked them in the eyes. Not if I stand in her way. They hesitated. Even if it's dangerous? Especially then, I said. The days crawled by. Every crunch of snow on the path sent my heart racing. Then, one afternoon, the sound of hooves, slow, deliberate. Through the window, I saw her. Tall, gray coat, black bonnet pulled low, buggy drawn by a dun-colored mare. Eyes sharp as frost. Sister Merritt. The children clustered behind me as I stepped outside. The wind caught my shawl, but I stood straight. She climbed down, gaze sweeping the yard, the cabin, the children. Mrs. Granger, she said, voice flat as winter earth. I'm Ada, I replied. I've come for the children, she said. They're not yours to take, I answered. Her gaze narrowed. We'll see. The wind cut sharper than any blade as I stood facing her across the frozen yard. Sister Merritt, with eyes like polished flint, seemed carved from the same winter that bit our cheeks raw. Behind me, the children hovered just inside the doorway. I could feel them without looking, the youngest clutching a fold of my skirt, the oldest with shoulders squared, and the middle child standing utterly still, like breath held too long. Sister Merritt took a step closer, boots sinking into the thin crust of snow. I remember her, she said, chin tilting toward the middle child. Silent, stubborn thing. Never spoke except in sleep, whispering a name that didn't belong to her. My jaw tightened. That name does belong, I said. And you'd do well to remember, sister, that not every scar is yours to claim. She folded her gloved hands neatly over her satchel. We sheltered them, fed them, taught them scripture. They owe us obedience. They owe nothing but breath to this world. I shot back. Her mouth twitched, almost a smile, but without warmth. You let grief blind you, Mrs. Granger. You mistake silence for consent. Children do not know what is best. And yet, I said, voice steady despite the pounding in my chest, sometimes silence holds more truth than words. She tried again, softer this time. I remember her humming a tune, even when punishment awaited. That stubbornness cost her dearly, you know. A flicker of movement in the doorway, just enough to see the middle child tense. My voice dropped to a low growl. If you so much as raised a hand to her, discipline is not cruelty, Sister Merritt cut in. Children stray. They must be guided back to the path. I stepped closer. And what path was that? One where they forget who they were. Her gaze hardened. One where they survive. And yet they ran, I said, and kept running until they found me. For the first time her mask slipped. Just a moment of something raw frustration, perhaps, or fear, but it was gone before the wind could catch it. She straightened, drawing herself tall. The law is on my side. Papers signed. Witnesses willing. I met her stare. And the truth is on mine. One of them remembers me. And the others, they've chosen. Children cannot choose. She spat. They already did, I whispered. That night sleep did not come. The children lay on their pallets by the stove, breath shallow in the cold air. I sat by the dying fire, running a thumb over the worn grain of the rocking chair's arm, listening to the logs crackle. Outside, frost crept across the windows, sketching lace patterns that the morning sun would shatter. My mind churned with words unspoken, threats unmade. I thought of the law, the sheriff caught between duty and doubt, the townsfolk who stared with mouths closed and hearts shuddered. But more than anything, I thought of the middle child, the quiet resolve in her eyes, the memory she dared to keep alive. Dawn brought brittle light and fresh dread. Sister Merritt returned. this time with Reverend Colby and two men from town. They dismounted, boots crunching over frost-bitten earth, faces carved from caution and guilt. Reverend Colby cleared his throat, voice rough. "Ada, we come only to see the children. No force, no harm. And if they choose to stay?" I asked. He hesitated. "Then Sister Merritt returns empty-handed. And if fear keeps them silent?" I counted. He looked away, unable to answer. The youngest hid behind my skirts, peeking out with wide, wet eyes. The oldest stepped closer, jaw clenched, shoulders squared in quiet defiance. But it was the middle child who moved first. She stepped forward, bare feet pale against the frozen step, arms wrapped tight around herself. Sister Merritt's gaze softened by a hair. "Child," she said, voice dipping to something almost gentle, "you remember me?" The girl did not speak. She simply lifted her sleeve, revealing the thin, roped scar across her wrist. "I remember," she whispered, voice shaking but clear, "but not the way you want." Silence. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Sister Merritt stepped closer. "And what do you remember?" The girl's gaze locked with hers. Cold floors, locked doors, prayers that hurt more than hunger. Sister Merritt flinched, barely but enough. "And do you remember love there?" the girl asked. Nothing, no answer. The girl turned, eyes finding mine. "Here," she said, so quiet, it barely reached my ears. "I remember warmth." The Reverend's voice broke the quiet. "Sister Merritt," but she shook her head, steel returning to her spine. "Children lie," she spat. The oldest stepped forward now. "Then why are we still silent when you speak?" The youngest voice trembling. "We chose her." I saw it then, the shift in the Reverend's face is softening, a fracture in certainty. Sister Merritt saw it too. Her eyes narrowed. "You're making a mistake," she hissed. I lifted my chin. "Better my mistake than your mercy." They left that day, dust trailing behind them like a ragged cloak, but the quiet they left behind felt brittle, uneasy. That night, rocks struck the windows, shouts echoed from the road. "Thief! Witch! Liar!" The oldest stood by the door, muscles taut as bowstrings. The youngest buried her face against my side, sobs shaking her thin shoulders. The middle child did not move. She only watched me, waiting to see if I would bend. I did not. By morning, soot smeared across our door, black letters spelling out, "Send them back." I scrubbed the words clean until my hands bled. The children watched, silent, the snow stained pink where water and blood mixed. When I finished, I turned to them, chest heaving. "They want fear," I said, breath ragged. "We give them nothing." In the days that followed, tension coiled tighter. At market, voices hushed when I passed. Coins clinked slower into my hand. Bread weighed heavy with doubt. The blacksmith, once friendly, avoided my gaze. Mrs. Kendall turned her back, skirts brushing the dirt in a whisper of scorn. Only Harriet Morrison dared a nod, small but enough to keep my spine straight. But inside the cabin, the silence changed. The youngest began humming to herself as she helped knead bread, small tunes without words. The oldest carved figures from driftwood and left them on my windowsill each dawn. A goat, a sparrow, once even a woman with her hands outstretched. The middle child took my hand one cold evening, pressing her palm to mine. No words but the weight of that touch spoke louder than anything. One night, as the wind howled outside, the middle child spoke again. "Will they ever stop?" I looked into her eyes, the scar pale against her wrist. "Maybe not," I said honestly. "Then why keep us?" she whispered. "Because keeping you feels truer than losing you ever did," I answered. The cold wasn't just outside anymore. It had seeped into the very bones of the town, a chill born not of winter's hand, but of fear, suspicion, and long-held grudges that bubbled just beneath polite smiles and quiet conversations. It crept through the streets, curling under doorways, wrapping around whispered accusations in the market and the tavern. I could feel it the moment I stepped into town that morning, the weight of eyes pressing down, the invisible noose tightening with every cautious glance. Behind me, the children trailed silently, their bare feet muffled by the dust and frost that mingled on the road. The youngest clutched the hem of my coat like a lifeline. The middle child, ever still, walked with the quiet confidence of someone carrying the weight of secrets too big for her age. The oldest's gaze was fierce, defiant, against a world that sought to label them as outsiders, as trouble, as less than. I tightened my grip on the reins, feeling my jaw set. We were no longer just a family surviving on the edge of town. We were a symbol, a target. I'd hoped the church might offer sanctuary, but even Reverend Colby's once kind eyes now held an icy judgment. The hymns sang around us like ghosts of acceptance lost. Mothers hushed their children when we passed. Fathers exchanged glances loaded with unspoken questions. At the market, whispers rose like smoke. "She bought those children," one woman murmured. "Can't be right. That's not natural. They don't belong here," another said, voice low enough to be a prayer or a curse. But there was no place for us to hide from the growing storm. That afternoon, I found a note slipped under the cabin door. Sharp letters scratched into paper. "You can't protect what isn't yours." I crushed it in my fist, tasting the bitterness of a fight I didn't ask for, but couldn't walk away from. The children gathered close, eyes wide and searching. I knelt to meet them, brushing fingers through their tangled hair. "We stand together," I said, "always." But Sister Merritt was no ghost of a threat. Now she was flesh and blood, a storm bearing down. She arrived in a carriage darker than the night, flanked by two men whose faces were carved from stone and suspicion. The air snapped with tension as they approached the cabin, boots thudding like distant thunder on the frozen earth. I met Sister Merritt at the door, standing tall despite the tremble in my chest. "You're defying the law," she said, voice cold and unyielding. "These children belong to the orphanage. You've stolen them." I shook my head. "They were sold at auction illegally. I bought them. I saved them." Her laugh was a sharp blade. "Saved?" They ran from discipline, from love disguised as chains. My voice was steady but fierce. "Love never leaves scars." The middle child stepped beside me, small but unbreakable. She lifted her sleeve, revealing the faded scar, a silent testament to the pain they'd endured. "They're not your property," I said. "They're human beings, and they choose where they belong." Sister Merritt's eyes flickered with something like doubt, but her resolve hardened. "You're making a dangerous mistake." "Perhaps," I said, "but it's mine to make." That night, the town's anger turned to violence. The pounding on the cabin door was relentless, stones hurled through windows, taunts carried on the wind. The children huddled inside, wide-eyed but silent. I loaded the shotgun, the cold steel a bitter comfort in my hands. "We won't let them break us," I whispered, voice shaking but resolute. Morning revealed the scars left behind: shattered glass, scorched earth, and a new message painted in red across the porch. "Leave now, or face the consequences." But something had changed in the children. The youngest no longer trembled. The oldest met every stare with fire. The middle child hummed a tune, a soft, broken melody that carried hope like a fragile flame. In the weeks that followed, we rebuilt. Each nail hammered into the wood was a vow, a promise to protect, to endure, to love. Caleb carved a gate, strong and sturdy. June planted wildflowers, bright and bold against the gray earth. And Annie, the middle child, began to speak, not in words, but in drawings, charcoal sketches of hands reaching out, of a house full of light and laughter. The town remained divided. Some saw us as a threat. Others quietly began to soften. Harriet Morrison slipped the loaf of bread onto the porch without a word. The blacksmith offered tools with a nod. Even Reverend Colby's sermons grew less harsh, a tentative bridge being built from the ashes. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the ridge, Annie looked up at me. "Will they ever accept us?" she asked, eyes shining with a mixture of hope and fear. I smiled. pulling her close. Maybe not today, I said. But every day we stay, we build that acceptance, one small step at a time. And so we did. Together, we faced the storm battered but unbroken. Because family is not just blood or papers, it's the scars we carry, the love we fight for, and the home we choose to build against all odds. Ada's voice echoed through the years, a reminder that even in the darkest places, the light of belonging can never be extinguished. Days turned into weeks, and the cold grip of winter began to loosen. It was as if the earth itself had decided to grant us a reprieve, a small breath of mercy amid the hardships we faced. The ridge where I lived with the children, once shrouded in frost and silence, slowly warmed beneath the gentle caress of an emerging spring. Inside the cabin, life stirred with cautious hope. The fire crackled with a steady rhythm, shadows dancing along the worn wooden walls where old quilts still hung, carrying the faint scent of cedar and memories I'd long kept buried. Annie, June, and Caleb, names I had given them not out of ownership, but out of the desperate need to restore identity to those who had lost so much, had begun to settle in. They still carried the weight of their silence, but now it was less a barrier and more a quiet pact between us. Annie especially was changing. Her once distant gaze softened, and her eyes flickered with curiosity and sometimes the tentative spark of laughter. I saw it in the way she hummed the tune she'd whispered to me on that first night, Hickory Hill. It was her secret melodia thread, connecting the fragments of her scattered past to the fragile promise of belonging. One afternoon, as I sat mending a torn sleeve, Annie drew near with a bundle of charcoal sketches cradled in her hands. She handed them to me without a word. The drawings were rough, smudged lines revealing fleeting images, a house engulfed in flames, a tree with broken branches, hands reaching toward one another, a kite tangled in a stormy sky. I traced my finger over the images, feeling a familiar ache swell in my chest. These weren't just memories, they were fragments of a story she couldn't yet tell in words. Your story, I whispered softly. You don't have to carry it alone. She looked up, eyes shimmering with unshed tears, and for the first time she nodded. Outside the cabin, the world was shifting too. The town of Dry Hollow, once cold and unwelcoming, was beginning to thaw. It wasn't swift or absolute prejudice, and suspicion still lingered in the glances of some, but small gestures spoke louder than words. Harriet Morrison, the general store clerk, started leaving extra flour and sugar on our doorstep. She never spoke of it, only offering a brief nod if our eyes met. The blacksmith, a burly man named Tom, began stopping by with tools and wood scraps, helping Caleb build a small addition to the cabin. Even Reverend Colby, whose sermons once echoed with warnings of disobedience and sin, had softened. His eyes met mine one Sunday with something close to understanding, and when the choir sang a new hymn song Annie had hummed quietly under her breath, I found myself joining in, voice trembling but true. Yet, beneath the surface of these hopeful signs, shadows remained. Sister Merritt had not forgotten us. Rumors whispered of new visitors from Bent Creek, strangers sent to retrieve the children by force if necessary. The night air carried a cold promise of danger, but I refused to let fear dictate our lives. One evening, as twilight bled into darkness, Annie pulled me aside. Her voice was barely audible. Do you think they'll come for us again? I held her close. If they do, we'll face them together, and this time we'll be ready. The children's bond with each other grew stronger with every passing day. June, once the silent shadow, began speaking in whispers. She told me of small joys, the way the wildflowers bloomed near the barn, how Caleb whittled wooden animals, the soft songs Annie hummed in the night. Caleb, for all his quiet strength, was learning to trust. His eyes, once hardened by hunger and fear, now held a light that reminded me painfully of my own lost son. Together they were building a family, not the one fate had intended, but one forged in resilience and love. I too was learning to heal. The years of grief, of silence, of holding pain close like a shield, began to loosen their grip. I found moments of laughter, soft, hesitant, but real. The warmth of three small hands in mine as we tended the garden. The smell of fresh bread baking in the oven. The quiet satisfaction of a day spent in simple tasks. Sometimes, late at night, I'd sit by the fire, watching the children sleep. Their faces were peaceful, free from the terror that had once haunted them. In those moments, I allowed myself to hope not just for survival, but for a future where we belonged. But hope is a fragile thing. One morning, a letter arrived, sealed with the mark of Bent Creek. My hands trembled as I broke the wax, eyes scanning the words penned in cold script. They demanded the immediate return of the children. They claimed legal ownership, threatened consequences for defiance. The letter was a reminder that our peace was temporary, a fragile bubble in a world still harsh and unforgiving. I gathered the children close, sharing the letter with careful words. "We will not go back," I promised. "We belong here, together." Their eyes shone with a mix of fear and defiance. It was clear the battle ahead was far from over. As spring gave way to summer, we prepared. Caleb sharpened his tools, building fences and barricades. June learned to sew sturdy clothes, patching old wounds with thread and care. Annie practiced speaking, each word a step toward reclaiming her voice. And I steeled myself to face whatever storms might come, holding tight to the fragile light of family we had created. The world beyond our cabin remained uncertain, but inside, love grew wild and strong. Against the odds, we had found something precious, belonging, and no force could take that away. Spring had barely settled over the ridge when the shadows crept back into our lives. The warmth in the air couldn't thaw the chill that suddenly clung to the town, to the very ground beneath our feet. It was as if the land itself was holding its breath, waiting for the inevitable storm. I could feel it in the looks cast our way when we passed through Dry Hollow, quick glances that flickered with suspicion, thinly veiled hostility. The once faint murmurs of gossip had grown into whispered accusations, and the coldness in the eyes of some townsfolk was sharper than any winter wind. It began with small things. The doors of the general store would close just as we approached. Neighbors, who had once nodded politely, now crossed the street to avoid us. The church pews we had once joined now seemed reserved for everyone but the three children and me. But the true warning came one night, under a moonless sky, when I found a small pile of stones arranged in a crude circle on the porch. Scrawled beside it in white chalk were words meant to cut deep. Thieves, liars, witches. I knelt beside the stones, running my fingers through the cold dirt. The children watched silently from the shadows, their wide eyes reflecting a fear I tried to mask with quiet resolve. "We'll face whatever comes," I promised, more to myself than to them. The letter from Bent Creek still weighed heavily in my satchel. Each time I read it, the ink seemed to burn brighter on the fragile parchment, threatening to set ablaze the life we had built. They wanted the children returned. They claimed ownership. They spoke of laws and rights, but to me they only spoke of chains. Sheriff Boone's visit that afternoon was more solemn than before. His usual steady gaze flickered with uncertainty. "I can't stop what's coming, Ada," he said quietly, lowering his hat. "The pressure is rising. They want results." I met his eyes, steady and unyielding. "Then I'll be the one they find standing in the way." The nights grew longer and filled with restless shadows. The children huddled close by the fire, clutching at the blankets I had sewn with trembling hands. Annie was the first to break the silence, her voice barely above a whisper. "Will they take us away?" I held her tightly, my heart aching with the weight of that question. How do you tell a child that the world can be cruel, that love is sometimes a fragile shield? "Not while I'm here," I said firmly. The town's gathering grew more hostile by the day. A group of men, faces grim and voices loud, came to the edge of my property one evening, banging pots and pans, shouting words meant to intimidate. The youngest child cried softly in my lap, but I refused to open the door. I did not give them the satisfaction of fear. Instead, I whispered into the darkness, "They'll tire before we do." And as dawn broke, the yard was empty save for a small pile of stones, their final warning, scattered and washed away by my boot. Inside, life was a fragile dance between fear and hope. Caleb crafted wooden fences with care, June mended clothes and tended the garden, and Annie was learning to speak in full sentences, each word a rebellion against the silence imposed by their past. Their smiles were rare but precious, like flowers blooming defiantly in cracked earth, but the peace was not the last. One afternoon, a buggy rumbled down the dusty road, black cold, and bearing the cross-stitched mark I dreaded. Sister Merritt arrived once more, eyes sharp as steel, lips tight with determination. Sheriff Boone stood by my side, torn between duty and sympathy. "They're not yours to keep, Ada," Sister Merritt said coldly. "These children belong to the orphanage, to us." My voice was steady but fierce. "They belong here, with me." The standoff lasted long into the afternoon, words exchanged like weapons, but I saw something in the children's strength, belonging that no paper or claim could erase. The middle child, the one I had come to know as Annie, stepped forward barefoot, head held high. "You're not my mother," she said to Sister Merritt. The words hung heavy, sharp as knives. Then, turning to me, she whispered, "You are." Sister Merritt faltered, the steel in her eyes flickering with uncertainty. "I remember warmth," Annie continued softly. "A woman who never screamed, who braided my hair, who sang a song called Hickory Hill." She looked at me then, her gaze steady and sure. "That's you." The night was thick with tension, but inside our cabin, something deeper settled, a quiet affirmation of belonging and love. Sister Merritt's arrival had reignited old wounds, but it also made clear what we were fighting for. I held Annie close, whispering promises not just of safety, but of home. Days later, whispers in town softened again. The preacher's sermons spoke less of judgment and more of compassion, while Harriet Morrison slipped extra flour into my hands with a faint smile. The blacksmith's gifts were more frequent. Even Samuel Tibbets, the school teacher's husband, kept a watchful but less hostile eye. But I knew the battle was far from over. Love was no shield against laws written in distant halls, nor against the cruelty bred in fear and ignorance. Yet as the seasons changed, I believed more fiercely than ever that belonging was a power stronger than any shadow. Each night, I sat by the fire, the children's breathing soft, and even in sleep. The scars on their arms told stories of survival, but in those quiet moments, their faces shone with a light no past could dim. And in my heart, I whispered a vow: we would hold on, we would fight, we would be family. Because, in the end, love was the only truth that mattered. Silence felt heavier than any burden I had known before. After Sister Merritt's visit and the difficult moment that raised many questions, the children and I became more quiet, trying to find peace in a world that seemed tough. Peace was fragile, and in our home on the hill, some things stayed hidden, waiting quietly. One evening, as the sun set behind the hills, I saw Annie, the middle child, looking at a small piece of cloth she had found in a drawer. It was old and worn, but she looked at it with care. I sat next to her and asked softly, "Where did you find that?" She looked at me with a mix of hope and worry. "It was in my bag when I came here," she said quietly. "I didn't show it to anyone before." The cloth gave comfort, but also raised questions. I knew then that the past was still with us, not just in the town's whispers, but in the children's stories. In the next days, June and Caleb helped me clean the attic. Among old things, I found a box wrapped carefully. Inside were letters, old and fragile, tied with a thin ribbon. These letters were from my pasta mother, holding on to hope when times were hard. One letter spoke about a hard time, a change, and a promise that was broken. It told of 3 children separated from their family, lost and uncertain. Reading the letter, the past came alive again. I felt all the feelings hidden for so long. That night, I showed the letters to Annie. Her eyes filled with tears, as she touched the paper. "It's from my mother," she whispered. She shared small memory-short images of a night with firelight, a hand reaching out, a soft song sung long ago. She spoke of names, said quietly, of faces blurred by time. I realized the children were not just survivors. They were part of my own story, separated but never lost. The town's worries felt smaller compared to what we found. This was about family, not strangers. But telling the truth had a cost. People in town quickly heard the story. Some were worried, some angry. They wanted the children to be cared for elsewhere, saying it was for their good. I stood strong. "These children are mine. They are my family," I said with a steady voice. There was silence, then some disagreement, but I did not give up. That night, as the children slept, I sat by the fire with the letters spread before me, feeling calm. Love had brought us back. Love had repaired our lives. No law or fear could change that. In the following days, I taught the children to read the letters and the stories. They held stories of hope and strength. June smiled as she read. Caleb carefully made a small box to keep the letters safe. Annie sang the soft song I had sung before, a song that now belonged to us all. The town watched quietly, some softening, others not. But I knew our journey was not over. In quiet moments, under the stars, and by the fire, we found strength together, a family, not only by blood but by heart. As seasons changed, I understood the past, with all its hardships, could not hold us back, because we were more than survivors. We were family. The weight of the town's judgment was heavier than the coldest winter night. Days passed with eyes watching from behind curtains and whispers drifting like ghosts through every street. They saw me as a stranger, a meddler, someone who brought chaos with the quiet children, who spoke no words, but told stories with their scars and silences. I felt the pulse of old wounds open anew, but this time I wasn't alone. Annie, June, and Caleb clung to me with a fierce need that reminded me why I had chosen this impossible path. The schoolteacher's husband, Samuel Tibbets, was the unofficial voice of the town's caution. His eyes, sharp and calculating, met mine one afternoon in the general store. "You're playing a dangerous game, Maida," he warned, his tone low but steady. "They won't stop. You can't protect them forever." I looked past him at the three children sitting quietly by the door, their gazes lost in a world only they understood. "I'm not protecting them from the world, Samuel," I said quietly. "I'm protecting them from losing themselves again." That night, under the thin light of a waning moon, I found Annie sitting outside by the withered orchard. She clutched a wooden spoon Caleb had carved for her and hummed the old lullaby. Her voice was small but steady. "Do you think they'll ever believe us?" she asked without looking up. I sat beside her, the cold seeping into my bones but warmth spreading from my heart. "They'll have to," I whispered, "because this time we're not running." The next morning brought a harsh knock at the door. Sheriff Boone, flanked by two deputies, stood rigid on the porch. "Miss Granger," he said, his voice steady but his eyes betraying a weariness I hadn't seen before. "There's a warrant to take the children back to Bent Creek. Sister Merritt has raised concerns again." I swallowed hard, the old fear clawing at my throat. "They're not going anywhere," I said firmly. The sheriff nodded slowly, the weight of his duty pressing down on him. "I'm here to warn you. If you resist, things will get ugly." I closed the door gently and turned to the children. "We have to prepare," I said, "but not to run, to stand." For days I taught Annie how to hold a shotgun, not to shoot, but to understand its power. June and Caleb learned to recognize every sound outside the cabin, the crunch of footsteps, the whisper of the wind, the distant bark of a dog. Our home became a fortress not just of wood and nails, but of hope and defiance. One evening, the drums began again, pots and pans banging, voices chanting at the edge of the field. The mob came down the ridge, their faces obscured by shadows and fury. The children huddled close, their eyes wide but unyielding. I stepped out onto the porch, the shotgun resting heavy in my hands. "They think we're animals," I told them. But we're more than that. We're family. The crowd paused, murmurs rippling through the dark. Then came the shouting voice I recognized. Sister Merritt, standing at the forefront, eyes sharp and cold. "You are breaking the law, Ada," she said. "These children belong to the orphanage. You have no right." I raised the shotgun, steady and clear. "They belong to no one who would separate them," I said. "Not again." The standoff stretched on, tension thick as the night air. Suddenly, from the shadows, a figure stepped forward, Samuel Tibbets. "They're mine too," he said quietly. The crowd faltered, confused. "I may have been wrong," he continued. "They deserve a chance to be more than what we feared." The tide shifted. One by one, others stepped forward, neighbors who had seen the children's kindness, their quiet courage. A fragile truce was born in the cold darkness. The next day the town held a meeting, voices raised and hearts uncertain. But I stood firm, holding the letters, the scars, the memories that bound us. "I will not give up on these children," I said, "because they are my family, and love is stronger than fear." Slowly, the walls of suspicion cracked. Annie began to speak words hesitant but true. June smiled again, laughter returning like spring after a long winter. Caleb carved new spoons and small wooden hearts, gifts of peace and promise. One afternoon, Reverend Colby approached the cabin with a gentle smile. "I see now," he said softly. "You've done what none of us dared." I nodded, exhaustion and relief tangled in my chest. That night, as the fire flickered low, I sat with the children, holding Annie close. "We're home," I whispered. The three of them nestled against me, the silence no longer heavy but full of unspoken love. In the weeks that followed, the town's coldness thawed. Neighbors brought food, teachers offered lessons. Life began to weave us into the fabric of the community, not as outcasts, but as family. I watched the children grow not just in body but in spirit. The scars on their wrists faded, replaced by smiles and whispered dreams. The house on the ridge blossomed into a home, and I learned something powerful. Family is not only what we are born into, it is what we choose, what we fight for, what we love. The dawn broke soft and pale over the ridge, but inside me the storm finally quieted. After months of battle against the town, against ghosts of my past, against the silence that once threatened to swallow us whole, we were finally breathing the same air of peace. It wasn't perfect. The scars on our skin and souls remained. But somehow, in the stillness of that morning, they felt less like chains and more like maps, paths leading us forward. I watched the children sleep, sunlight catching the edges of their faces, and my heart ached in the best possible way, full and raw and alive. The months that followed our confrontation with the town's fury became a slow dance toward healing. People who once turned their backs began to nod with cautious smiles. The children's laughter started echoing through the fields, fragile as butterfly wings but persistent. I could see it in the way Caleb held his head higher, no longer just the boy who carved spoons, but a young man learning to carve his own destiny. June, with her wildflower gardens, naming every petal and leaf, taught me that beauty could sprout even from the roughest earth. And Annie Shea found her voice in whispered stories, songs humming soft and steady like a heartbeat. We were family, not by blood alone, but by choice, by survival, by love. The winter was harsh that year, biting at the cabins and rattling the windows, but inside we had built a warmth no frost could freeze. One night, after putting the children to bed, on quilts piled beside the hearth, I sat by the fire alone, the flames casting shadows that danced like memories on the walls. I thought of the years lost, the children I'd buried in my mind and heart, the fire that stole everything I thought I had, and now, here they were not lost anymore, but found. The bell at the church rang clear the next Sunday morning, calling the town to gathering. I stood at the edge of the crowd, cloak wrapped tight, breath steady but heart pounding. When Annie stepped forward to sing a hymn she had taught herself, the voice trembling but true, something shifted. Eyes that had once looked away now found courage to meet mine. The preacher, Reverend Colby, nodded with a small smile. "We welcome you," he said softly, "but peace is never without its shadows." One afternoon, as the sun was setting gold over the ridge, a letter arrived. The ink was faded, but the threat unmistakable. Someone from Bent Creek was coming, someone who would not rest until the children were taken back to the orphanage, to a place they feared. I held the letter in shaking hands, but the children stood beside me unflinching. The arrival was quiet, but heavy, a woman in dark robes, her eyes hard as winter ice. Sister Merritt. She came to claim what she said was rightfully hers. But this time I was ready. The town gathered, whispers turning to murmurs of doubt. Who were these children now? Were they lost, or had they found something the world couldn't take? I looked Sister Merritt in the eye and said, "They are mine, not because of paper or law, but because of love and memory, because I stood when others turned away." Annie stepped forward, her voice steady. "You are not my mother, but she is." June and Caleb joined her, their hands linked. The crowd held its breath. The woman faltered, then turned away. She left the town that day, but the story stayed a story, not of loss, but of belonging. Years passed, like whispered prayers. The children grew into the people they were meant to be, shaped by love's fierce hands. Caleb became a blacksmith, strong and steady, his laughter ringing louder than any hammer. June married, the school teacher's son, her wildflower garden blooming brighter every spring. And Annie stayed, a quiet force, running the cabin with the wisdom of someone who had known both heartbreak and healing. I grew old on that ridge, my hands weathered but steady, my heart full. The scars on the children's wrists faded, but never the mark they left on my soul. We were no longer the lost ones. We were home. On the day I passed, Annie was there, holding my hand as I hummed Hickory Hill one last time. At my funeral, as the preacher opened the Bible, Annie stepped forward. She didn't speak words written in any book. She simply looked up at the wildflowers blooming over my grave and placed 3 tiny stone scarves with the names we had given each other. Annie, June, Caleb. "I didn't find them," she said softly to the crowd. "They found me." And she let us stay. The town remembered me not as a widow, not as a stranger, but as the woman who loved fiercely enough to bring broken souls back to life. Because, in the end, family isn't what we are born into. It's what we fight for, what we choose, what we love no matter what. If this story touched your heart or reminded you of someone you love, hit that like button and share it with your friends. Don't forget to subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss a story that moves your soul. Tell me in the comments, which moment in the story gave you chills? Or have you ever found family where you least expected it? Your stories matter here. Let's build this community of hope and belonging together. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next chapter of Life Stories.